Before I call the member to ask the urgent question, I wish to make a short statement about sub judice resolution. The matter of the data breach is not sub judice. However, I've been advised that an individual has been charged with terrorism-related offences following the data breach. While I'm content to waive the sub judice resolution in this and other proceedings to allow simple reference to the fact of the arrest, any further discussion of the circumstances of that case would not be in order. I now call Sir Geoffrey Donaldson to ask his urgent question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland if he will make a statement on the breach of security and data protection at the Police Service of Northern Ireland.
Service Day.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his urgent question. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, I was keen to do a statement on the Police Service of Northern Ireland's data breach on the 8th of August, so I'm pleased to have this opportunity. And I'm also happy to provide an update to the House on this matter. However, since writing this answer, the right honourable gentleman will now know that news of the PSNI's Chief Constable's resignation has broken in the last few minutes. I would thank Simon Byrne for his years of public service. He will know that the appointment of a new Chief Constable is a matter for the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and I'll continue to liaise with the senior management team of PSNI whilst the process of appointing a successor gets underway. The PSNI continues to have my and the government's full support in responding to the data breach and our focus on providing appropriate and proportionate data and expertise. The breach, where the personal information of over 10,000 officers and staff was accidentally published in what appears to be a human error involving a number of spreadsheet fields, happened on the 8th of August. Not realising the relevant document contained a hidden table, the initials of surnames of every rank and grade, the location where an individual was based, but not their home address, and their duty type was published online for approximately 3 hours. The data breach is deeply concerning and significant. Recent events in Northern Ireland, including the terrible attack on Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell, show there are still a small minority in Northern Ireland who wish to cause harm to PSNI officers and staff in Northern Ireland. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those individuals who work to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe. My many thanks, and we all owe them our gratitude. I recognise too that there is significant concern about the consequences of this data breach. Many PSNI officers and staff have raised concerns about themselves and their family, and they have my support and understanding as they go about their important work keeping communities safe in these worrying and most testing of circumstances. To them again, I say thank you. In response to these concerns, the PSNI and wider security partners are taking appropriate action and are working around the clock to investigate the incident, provide reassurance and mitigate any risk to the safety and security of officers and staff. As of the 30th of August, 3,954 self-referrals have been made to the PSNI's Emergency Threat Management Group. This is part of the welfare and support services which have been made available to PSNI officers. The House will understand that PSNI is devolved and has operational independence. This has been the case since April 2010 with the creation of the Department of Justice. However, as you would expect, Mr. Speaker, the government has remained in close contact with PSNI since this breach and other data breaches came to light. My officials and I have been receiving regular updates, and the government's focus has been on providing specialist support and expertise to PSNI's handling of this issue. Officials in the Cabinet Office have chaired Am I about right? Okay, I'll finish this in a second, Mr. Speaker, but officials in the Cabinet Office have chaired regular meetings, and I will update the House further, hopefully during this urgent question.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to raise the plight of police officers and staff in Northern Ireland. The industrial-scale breach in data last month was yet another self-inflicted blow to the morale of the police service, as well as to confidence in policing across Northern Ireland. For the rank and file members and for the staff who work in our police stations, for their personal details to be released into the public domain and find its way into the hands of dissident Republicans is frankly unforgivable. The current terrorist threat in Northern Ireland, the threat level is severe. Just a few months ago, DCI John Caldwell was barbarically attacked by gunmen in front of his young son after coaching an under-15s football team near Omagh. And now each one of his colleagues must now come to terms with the fact that they and their families have potentially been placed in harm's way by the release of this data. But it goes further than that, Mr. Speaker. Last week's ruling by Mr. Justice Schofield found that the PSNI Senior Command unlawfully disciplined 2 of its own officers in order to appease Sinn Féin. Mr. Speaker, these actions are hugely damaging to community relations, to community confidence and to confidence in the rule of law in Northern Ireland. Fair and even-handed policing is just as foundational to progress in Northern Ireland as is fully functioning political institutions operating on a cross-community consensus basis. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we need to hear from the Government that they will ensure the necessary resources are available to the police, notwithstanding budgetary constraints, to ensure that police officers, their families and police staff are properly protected against terrorist attack. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, we welcome the decision by the Chief Constable to announce his resignation. We believe that is the right thing to do in all the circumstances. And now we want to see confidence rebuilt in our police service, and we will work with the PSNI. They have our full support to achieve and deliver effective and efficient policing for everyone in Northern Ireland in a way that commands cross-community support.
Yeah, well done.
Secretary of State.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for, again, the question and the various questions he has posed. I can say to him that officials in the Cabinet Office have chaired regular operational meetings, initially daily, bringing together PSNI government departments and our world-class security services to ensure all of their collective skills, including cyber expertise, were being brought to bear in supporting PSNI's support to the breach. Mr. Speaker has ruled on sub-judice, and you'll appreciate for security reasons I can't comment on specific details of the response, but actually 6 individuals have been arrested by detectives in investigating the breach and the criminality connected to it. 5 have been released on bail to allow for further police inquiries, and 1 has been charged with possessing documents or records likely to be useful to terrorists, and another item. Finally, and the honourable gentleman mentioned money. The response to such a significant breach will obviously come with a cost. UK government is clear that security is paramount and the focus remains on support and expertise at this point, with Northern Ireland policing being devolved. And so it is for the Department of Justice to set their budget and ensure it can fulfil its duties and responsibilities. But it still remains a fundamental responsibility of the Executive, and in its absence, Northern Ireland departments, to run a balanced and sustainable budget. Where additional funding is required, the correct process must be followed, and this includes a whole host of different things. But I completely understand the honourable gentleman's point.
Teresa Willett.
This whole episode is just agonising, and I want to put on record my support and sympathy for all those brave men and women of the PSNI who fear for their security and their family's security as a result of what's happened. And can I urge the Secretary of State, will you do everything possible with the PSNI to make sure this never ever happens again, and to ensure that documents of this sensitivity are subject to sufficient protection to ensure that there's never any mistake of this sort made ever again?
Yes, I think the right honourable gentleman in his question referred to it as a self-inflicted wound, and it surely was. And to be quite frank, there should have been checks and balances in place. And so I completely agree with my right honourable friend. We will do what we can to assist the PSNI and the Department for Justice as she would expect. We keep abreast of these matters, as I hope I detailed in my answers to the questions. But this is a really significant breach, and it has, as one police officer put it to me, when I joined the police service and when I go to work, I used to think that maybe people knew what I did for a living. But now that's completely flipped. And I feel that they absolutely know what I do for a living, and that has changed the psychology around the whole piece. And so, I know there's a lot more assurances that need to be given for us to get to the place that she wishes to get to.
And I welcome the new Shadow Secretary of State, Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State that I look forward to working with him in the interests of peace, prosperity and progress in Northern Ireland. The release of the names and workplaces of thousands of PSNI officers and staff was doubtless inadvertent, but its consequences could not be more serious. And that has now been recognised by the Chief Constable, Simon Byrne, resigning, and I join the Secretary of State in thanking him for his service. Those who serve the PSNI confront great risks every day in the job they do to keep the public safe, and we thank them. But they already knew that dissident Republicans were targeting them and their families, and now they know that those who would do them harm have this list. The damage to morale and confidence cannot be underestimated, so the questions they are asking urgently are, what is going to be done to reassure and protect us? Does the Secretary of State agree that the inquiry that's being undertaken needs to be completed as quickly as possible? Can he confirm that he will approve the appointment of the new Chief Constable in the absence of a Justice Minister in Northern Ireland? Does he intend to review the operation of the Policing Board and how it functions? Does the Secretary of State recognise that there will be additional costs of protecting staff as well as responding to potential civil claims? There were already great pressures on the policing budget in Northern Ireland, and the cuts it is now facing will, in the words of the PSNI, leave the service smaller, less visible, less accessible and less responsive. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the whole House wants to ensure that the staff get the support, protection and reassurance they need. But to succeed in doing that, we really do need leadership from the government and from the political parties in Northern Ireland to get the Executive and the Assembly up and running again as quickly as possible.
Stay.
I thank the right honourable gentleman and welcome him to his place, and I look forward to working with him, as I mentioned outside the chamber, happily brief him on any aspects of what's my view and get him technical briefings from my officials so he can be up to speed very quickly. And I'd like to, if I may, put on record my thanks to the right honourable gentleman for Hove, for my former shadow who is present, for the way that he went about his business in shadowing me and the very cooperative way we dealt with business. I really appreciate it. I wish him well as we move forward. So it's all been set up by the Policing Board. I believe it reports in 3 months, but it's actually quite a fundamental inquiry. So I hope it will, in that time, be able to bring all the answers required to the table. He asked about the appointment of a future Chief Constable. Well, if the institutions of the Executive and the Minister for Justice isn't present, we will have to I believe, pass a piece of secondary legislation in this place to allow that to happen. But all that depends on the Policing Board going about their business and recruitment, and I believe it's very much a rubber stamp of the work that they do. And he asked about the Policing Board and reform. And I think now, I mean, I've spoken to a number of individual members of the Policing Board, and they all know that now actually the spotlight is on them and how they go about and this was before the resignation of the Chief Constable, but how they dealt with this. And I think I would like to wait and see as to how they discharge their duties over the course of the next few weeks before I even commit on reform, because I do believe there are good people there that have the ability to do the job. And then finally, on budget, I mentioned it in my answer, but at the end of the day, I mean, he forgot to mention almost certainly the Information Commissioner will come out with a decent fine for this data breach. There's a whole host of different things that we'll have to take into account, and as and when they materialise, we'll look at them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has mentioned the independence of the PSNI and that funding issues lie with the Ministry of Justice and the Executive. May I, Mr. Speaker, however, press the Secretary of State on this issue, that he will use his considerable influence to ensure that the safety of all those people is first and foremost and not the cost. And it is important that that influence that he has is exerted to its fullest, because these are good people who find themselves in a very, very difficult position through no fault of their own.
I like the feel that I've got considerable influence in government, but I'm not sure that is completely correct. However, I will use the influence that I do have. to do the right thing by all those that work for the PSNI. I mean, I actually do believe that policing, if you look at what's happened over the course of the last 25 years, and actually since policing was devolved, whilst there have been all sorts of issues that have come up over that time, policing in Northern Ireland certainly seems to look and feel better and beginning to get good outcomes for those that are being policed. And I can only praise the officers and say I'll do everything in their support.
Richard Thompson, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Secretary of State in offering my thanks to Simon Byrne for his service? I believe his decision today, however, is the right one. This represented a shocking breach of confidentiality, not just in terms of people's personal data, but it also represents a shocking breach in the confidence that PSNI officers and staff can have in the organisation. And I would like to pay tribute to the dedicated PSNI officers and staff who daily protect and serve the people in Northern Ireland. Now, the PSNI, as has been alluded to, is already suffering a crisis of funding and therefore resourcing. The officer complement is lower than it has been in the police service serving Northern Ireland at any point since 1979. Now, the UK government does pay £30 million a year in additional funding to meet the security challenge, but that funding was inadequate even before the state of breach, and it's surely even more inadequate now. So can I ask the Secretary of State to be a little bit more clear about how exactly he is going to give funding guarantees to the PSNI going forward, because I do not believe that this is something where the buck can be passed entirely to those who are currently charged with administering devolved budgets.
Yeah, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question? And he talked about the additional security funding that the government has put in. The UK government's contribution to the financial year 2022-23 is 32 million in this space, and but the cost implications of the PSNI response are rightly being discussed from the PSNI with the Department for Justice, and any additional asks for funding would come through a kind of an established process. And whilst it would not be ready for me to preempt that, the government's clear that security is paramount, and our focus remains currently on the asks that we have been made of us, which are providing specialist support and expertise in response to the latest assessments.
Julian Smith.
PSNI officers face significant physical risks, but they also face significant reputational and relationship risks when they're revealed as being members of the PSNI. The Guild of Catholic Officers and the Federation in Northern Ireland has done brilliant work over the last few weeks. Would the Secretary of State confirm he's engaging with those organisations as the government seeks to support the impact of this breach?
So I actually haven't spoken to the Guild of Catholic Officers yet personally, but I know my officials have on a number of occasions, and I'm very, very happy to do so. Initially, obviously, we were receiving high-level briefings from the Chief Constable and his senior management team, as well as I mentioned, the Cabinet Office committee that was set up that was receiving information and imparting information at an officer level. I actually think there's a lot, we're still at the beginning of this process, and so there's still a very, very long way to go. But and obviously the PSNI will have to reflect on today's news of the Chief Constable's resignation. So there is a lot more for government and the Secretary of State to do in this space, and I fully recognise that.
Colin Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that I think Simon Byrne has absolutely made the right decision in resigning today, given everything that has happened in recent weeks. But there is a much deeper and more significant problem than just one individual. And it's something we've been warning about for years. It's the real crisis in recruitment and retention of Catholic officers and staff to the PSNI. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the best way to deal with that crisis is to bring back 50-50 recruitment?
Secretary of State.
So in a conversation I had with the Honourable Gentleman last week, he talked about the Pitman reforms and the 50-50 recruitment and how it was a backward step to go away from that point. And I am a great believer that, I guess, in the kind of original aspects of policing, where peelism, where a police force should be reflecting the community that it polices. That's how it gains its confidence. I believe that actually recently, and I might be mistaken, but I believe I was briefed that recently there have been good levels of recruitment from Catholic communities into the PSNI. However, it's situations like the one we were talking about today that damage the prospects of that moving forward, and it's our job, it's all of our jobs, to make sure that does not happen.
Sir Robert Butler.
Mr. Speaker, if anybody was in any doubt about the particularly difficult and sensitive role that police officers in Northern Ireland play, they shouldn't be in any doubt now as a result of this appalling incident. Does my right honourable friend, has he been satisfied thus far that within the PSNI suitable measures have already been taken to make sure that freedom of information and subject access requests are dealt with by people of sufficient seniority, and that there is vetting and double checking of information before it is disclosed into the public domain?
Sir Estate.
I thank my right honourable learned friend for his very wise question, and yes, I can give him that assurance that the processes behind the issuing of freedom of information answers has been very well checked, and I'm sure will be checked and checked and checked again, and actually simplified, I believe, and with much more senior eyes, making sure that information goes out correctly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was in Northern Ireland the week after the breach, and the fact that officers continued to go outside about their duties is a testament to them and their service. But the fact that it remains secret for many people, the job they do, the fact that we are somehow thinking that this is normal for Northern Ireland 25 years after the peace process is unacceptable. This would not be normal in any other part of the UK or in Ireland. So what is the Secretary of State doing with the co-guarantors of the peace process, the Irish government, and the wider field in this, what is now clearly a crisis situation?
Sir Estate.
I mean, can I just firstly completely agree with the first part of her comments, because policing should be much more normalised in Northern Ireland. In fact, life should be. But there is an interesting and rich history, troubled history in Northern Ireland that has led us to where we have got to. And actually what the Chief Constable, before his resignation, had done in bringing community policing in Northern Ireland in the way he did, has actually, she would be able to walk around all sorts of places and feel like it was a much more normal policing experience. I've had conversations with my Irish counterparts, but this is very much something that rests with the UK government. But everyone is interested in how freedom of information requests are now dealt with.
Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too thank Simon Byrne for his service and join in recognising that in the current circumstances he has made the right decision in terms of resigning as position isn't tenable any longer. On the issue of the data breach, can I ask the Secretary to assure the House that money will not be any obstacle in the short run in terms of the relocation of any officer, because there will be people, particularly those from a Catholic nationalist background, those who are operating in intelligence and highly sensitive security roles, who are particularly exposed alongside everyone who's at risk, and that there will be no barriers put in place to ensure their safety, which is of utmost paramount.
I think I have to be quite careful in how I answer this, because it is very much related to security matters. But I think I can say that he is correct to assume what he assumes.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm heartened, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister is committing that there will be money in support for these officers, although money can't put it right. But will he also commit, because ministers come and go, governments come and go, to providing a regular update to maybe the Intelligence and Security Committee or the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on a confidential basis on the ongoing costs of this, because there is a danger that while this is long-term risk for officers, in short-term government thinking, this sort of support can wither on the vine.
Yeah, I mean, I'll happily find out the appropriate way of reporting as she suggests. As I think I've alluded to, I think this is going to have a very, very long tail. So this is going to, the ramifications of this, as it plays out, will ripple through the system for a very long time indeed.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I, on behalf of my colleagues, welcome the new Shadow Secretary of State to his place and look forward to working with him, and thank his predecessor, the since departed former Shadow Secretary of State, for all of his efforts in engaging with us. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important just to correct a number of inaccuracies from the Secretary of State's response. There was no hidden table, but as is common with Excel spreadsheets, there was more than one field. There was human error, but there were 5 levels of security to assess what was going out, all of which failed. Mr. Speaker, that speaks to systemic failure within the PSNI. And so in welcoming the resignation of the Chief Constable this afternoon, I think it's important that collectively, politically and in society, we all work together, and I hope the Secretary of State will support us in this to instil confidence again in the police service of Northern Ireland.
Well, I didn't know the honourable gentleman was such an expert in Excel, and I'm certainly not, so I'm happy to be corrected by him in the detail of that, but I think my statement was pretty much thorough, and I agree with what he says.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, as some members of this place know, my wife comes from County Armagh. We got married at the very height of the Troubles, and therefore the bombings and the shootings just sent a chill down my spine when I read of this leak. Yes, the honourable gentleman has referred to the difficulty of recruiting police service in Northern Ireland, and this will only make it worse. And secondly, it won't do much for our relationship with the police in the Republic of Ireland. The danger is, Mr. Speaker, that we just say, well, it's for PSNI, and take a view across the IRC. Northern Ireland is a constituent part of the United Kingdom, and therefore a United Kingdom solution, I hope, will be brought involving police forces this side of the IRC, and where necessary, the UK's intelligence services to find out what happened.
Yes, he is absolutely, completely correct, and which is why I detailed the number of the meetings of by officials in the Cabinet Office who really have chaired a large number of regular operational meetings, bringing together PSNI, government departments, world-class cyber security experts, and all to ensure all our collective skills across the Union are galvanised in this space.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the resignation of the Chief Constable? It's a pity it took so long. I think that he saw the writing on the wall when he knew a motion was going to the police board calling for his resignation, and so he should, because he's lost the confidence of officers, not just with this data breach, because he also is prepared to throw 2 junior officers to the wolves in order to placate Sinn Féin, and it was right that he should go. The Secretary of State in his answers about money has been a bit confusing. On one hand, he has said, yes, he recognises there will be considerable expenditure, Information Commissioner, mitigation measures, relocation of officers, etc. On one hand, he says this will have to come from the Justice Department budget. On the other hand, he seems to be implicating that the government will recognise that there's additional expenditure for the police. Given the police are already 600 officers under strength, will he give a commitment that additional costs as a result of this will not have to come from the existing overstretched budget?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I mean, forgive me for pushing back slightly, I think I've been particularly clear. And all of this could be better solved and much more easily solved if there was an executive in place. And I very much hope that happens.
Hannah.
The last few weeks have been hugely damaging to hard-won progress in our still fragile society, and ordinary officers are feeling vulnerable and demoralised, and we are thinking of them and also of the families of the Sean Graham murders who have been thrust into a political row they didn't seek due to a heavy-handed response. So in the interest both of officer morale and impartial policing, it's important that we know, following that Ormeau Road incident, who in the NIO spoke to the Chief Constable, and when the issue came up of Sinn Féin withdrawing from the policing board, what did the NIO say to the Chief Constable?
If you would kindly nod, does she mean in the last couple of weeks, or
after that incident at the shop?
incident itself? I'm afraid I will have to come back to her with that answer if I may, because I don't have those details.
Oh, Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, again, I thank the Secretary of State for his response. Ever mindful, Secretary of State, that the issue for my constituents is a real practical and physical issue. So can the Secretary of State outline what additional support and help has been made available to the PSNI officers who are under threat and whose families feel unsafe in their homes? Over the last some 38 years as an elected representative, both as a councillor, as an Assembly member and as a Member of Parliament, I've had a number of RUC and PSNI officers who were threatened and needed that assistance. That was available fairly urgently. Will the City of State confirm that those under threat, those 10,799 police officers and civilian staff, that a budget is available to rehouse as a priority, taking into consideration those who have moved from one district into another for safety reasons? They feel absolutely open and vulnerable to attack, and an apology is simply not enough to allow them to lie safely in their bed at night. What is needed, Mr. Speaker, is a practical and a physical solution. That's what I'm asking for.
State.
Yeah, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question and the way he puts it. Now, currently we're at a stage where the officers that have a concern and staff who have a concern are reporting it to their senior management, and there's a triage process that's been in place. And as I mentioned, as of last week, 30th of August, 3,954 people have self-referred themselves to the Emergency Threat Management Group within PSNI. I'll be very wary of mentioning what's been going on in terms of security matters for those at highest risk, so I will not, if the Honourable Gentleman will forgive me. But that process then continues to make sure, and the PSNI have both budget and process available to ensure extra security measures can be taken. There's extra training going in for those that just feel, and conversations going in to reassure. It'll be a little while before we see much pressure on budgets going upwards, and then I'll happily update the House.
That completes the urgent question. Just let people leave. I wish to do so quietly. Right, we now come to the